When we're trying to figure out the world around us, we want to study the life that we live in, all that takes place, including ourselves. It can sometimes take quite a bit of a journey. We may think that we have it all figured out, and this concept of trying to figure it out we can call science. But when we think we have it all figured out, or that science is the only method by which we can study our reality, and there aren't other methods or sciences that aren't considered science, then we might be under something called scientism.
But scientism is the idea that science is the only way to truth. Dr. Russell put it this way: whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific method, and what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know. That's a very foolish bit of logic, isn't it? Is that statement a statement of science? No, it isn't. It's a statement of what he believes. So you cannot know it if science is the only way to truth. So if it's true, it's false. So it's logically incoherent. Russell was quite a philosopher in that petition, but his logic left him when he made that statement.
Scientism is the very widespread and erroneous belief that science is all the real knowledge there is. In other words, that anything that cannot be understood through science really doesn't count as knowledge. And my talk was entitled Monopolizing Knowledge, because in a certain sense that's what scientism tries to do. Now it's very spread, dispersed. In the academy it's very often, in a certain sense, the air we breathe. So it's rarely expressed very explicitly. People don't very often get up and say, I think that science is all the real knowledge there is. That people don't do that. But what they often do is they take it as an unspoken assumption. And so it infiltrates itself into the thinking of ourselves and certainly of many people who want to attack religion, take that scientism as a kind of unspoken assumption or presumption in much of their arguments. I mean, the history of this world of human actors is not about reproducible events. It's very often the most unique and unusual events that attract the most interest. Musicians or people who study music can establish, let's say, and well understand and know, in a certain sense, the genius, let's say, of Johann Sebastian Bach, and yet that genius can't be understood or expressed in some kind of crisp mathematical way that possesses the kind of clarity that science calls for. So science can't encompass many of the things that are important in our life. Science actually is distinctive not just from religion, but it's also distinctive from history. It's also distinctive from arts or political analysis or sociology or jurisprudence. None of these things are sciences, and yet they have their own real knowledge. And it's a grave mistake. It's just simply an error to believe that science has all the knowledge that really is, and these other things don't have knowledge.
It's a worldview that has an integrating cosmology. That is, it has an integrated understanding of how the world is and what it fundamentally goes to make it up. It has an interpretive lens or filter. In other words, it's something that you look through that colors your interpretation of the world if you adopt a scientistic position. And it has a number of other things. For example, it has a justifying narrative history. It has, you might be surprised to know, it has a community of believers, and those believers, that community, look to scientism as a source of ethics. Now, why have I pointed out these things out? I've pointed them out because I submit that these are the kinds of characteristics of a religion.
Scientism is a philosophical system that says that's all there is. And if there's something of interest to you that science can't measure, just forget about it. It's off the table. It's irrelevant. Only the natural world and the scientific approach to it is worth talking about. And that's a belief system that is at least as strong in its requirements of suspending all kinds of other points of view than belief in God. Scientism is belief in the fact that we know so much that we can exclude the presence of God. That's the assertion of a universal negative, which frankly scientists aren't supposed to do.
In order for a belief to be rationally held, you must have evident, empirical, kind of scientific evidence for that belief. But if you take that as a rule about when beliefs are rational, and again apply it to itself, so I should only believe belief A if I've got B, a set of empirical evidence showing that A is true. But why should I believe that B, the contents of B, are real? Or that the contents of B really support view A? Well, in order to have those beliefs about B and for them to be rational, under the rule of scientism, I'd have to have C, a set of scientific empirical evidence supporting those. And you can see that we're into an infinite regress. We're kind of just digging ourselves into a bottomless pit. We can never actually fulfill that demand. So scientism, phrased in that way, generates a demand that simply can't be met, and would mean, if you took it seriously, that actually you couldn't do science, because you could never meet the demand of having a rational belief about anything. So to do science, you have to believe that there really is a physical world that exists independently of you, that you're investigating. But no amount of apparent empirical observation or experience could prove the philosophical idea that there really is an independently existing physical world, rather than, say, the Eastern pantheistic idea that all this reality is an illusion. You can't decide between those philosophies on the basis of apparent empirical experience.
Science tells us the truth. Those are the facts, and everything else is sort of opinion or belief or philosophy. That's not true. It turns out that there's a big difference between science as a methodology and scientism. When you say, here's a bunch of data or an organism or something, I'm going to test a hypothesis, and given the data, we either support it or refute it. That's science as a method. But a lot of people who call themselves scientists, they go beyond that method and they say, okay, well, here's the truth. There are many scientists, for example, who would say, there is no God. Okay, that's fine, but that's not a scientifically testable hypothesis. So why are you saying that? And the reason they say that is because they have a faith system of their own. So it's really important that we divide out the science, that is, the replicable hypothesis testing, historical analyses of data and the world, from the opinions of people who do that stuff.
So we want to be objective as human beings, but as human beings, we aren't necessarily all that objective, considering the fact we may have emotions and biases and fallacies that we are prone to. And so we want to maybe distinguish scientism to help us emphasize that there's this cult behavior or religious behavior form of science, and that science needs freedom or critical thinking. It needs the components that help us understand and escape cult behavior. Of course, this raises a lot of challenges, because we might say, well, we can explain empathy or this or that with science. And just because scientism might take place doesn't mean all science is scientism, and nor does it mean that something unscientific is scientific. All sorts of assumptions can come from this. But the point being said is that implicitly there are unspoken assumptions in our arguments where we are self-conceited. We attach to what we think we know, and we create limitations in our own head, forgetting other information. There might be this right brain or feminine that gets lost when we're in this super analytical left brain masculine, and people will even debate between left brain and right brain when masculine and feminine can also apply, and different ways can apply to understanding the same knowledge. Because science can get very analytical, this can be quite a difficult topic. As we talked about with academia and schooling and religion, it's very important to look at the different points of view. You don't have to agree with this, and in fact, perhaps you shouldn't if you actually want to do science.
So I frequently argue that humans are messy, complicated, and not so simple. I also argue that the way in which we think about science and practice evolutionary biology is influenced by racism, sexism, and historical, economic, and political frames. Because I make those cases, people say that, oh, I'm not doing science, I'm doing politics. What I try to do is say, okay, what's the topic you're arguing about? Let's do biology. Let's do anthropology. Let's do culture. Let's do ethnography. What is the data? What do we know? And this is something that's going on in the science community right now, and it's an incredibly exciting time because people are pushing back against this whole idea that we already know about sex that we already know about human variation, that we already know how things work. So, for example, when I argue that the binary, male-female, is not the best way to characterize humans, I am arguing that the biological dynamics and variation in human bodies is complicated and isn't always representative of this binary characterization, that there's more going on, and that understanding that more is central to doing a better job of understanding the human. Now, that's more complicated, and it goes against cultural norms. Everyone knows there's a right way to be a male and a female. I'm like, well, what about people who aren't male or female? What about senses of identity and gender and history and culture and politics and reality of biological dynamism? We either deal with the 100% of the problem and not just be happy to explain 80%, or we admit what we're doing. My argument is the data that cooperation, coordination, creativity, imagination are central in understanding the human, and that reductive approaches, either biological or cultural, are not going to get us sufficient answers. One of the most important things, I think, in the contemporary practice of science is diversifying the voices, the bodies, the experiences, and the modes of doing science. The more diverse group of humans that we have doing that, the better opportunities we have to get different perspectives, different views, different understandings, to get a more comprehensive picture of the world we find ourselves in. I think the world is complex and messy, and evolutionary biology and human evolution demonstrates that. However, I am very much struck by the fact that we are cooperative, we're collaborative, we're creative. That individualistic, competition-based, or gene-based reductionist approaches don't do the best job of categorizing science in general, and humans in particular, and therefore, we need to take a holistic and, I would say, generous approach to thinking about human biology, human history, human culture, and human evolution. Science is always done by humans, and humans are always messy, cultural, biased, believing creatures. And so we need to have the skill set and the collaboration to look at the science and understand it, not just via the scientist, but in its own right.
So isn't that interesting? Listening, observing, and maybe that includes finding out information that goes against all of tradition. And that could even include male and female. Are you open to that perspective? I will tell you, I may think there is only male and female, but do I care if somebody else thinks different from me? I'm going to listen to them, right? I'm going to care for them. I may not have to agree with them. And that's the point here, is you're not having to agree. He's not saying this is the truth and these people are bad, we need to attack them, we need to push this. He's sharing a different perspective. He's not pushing an agenda. He's just challenging the norm. But people may be quick to say, well, this is DEI, this is, equity, inclusion, this is trying to push a narrative, this is supporting this and that, this is funded by this and that. Well, okay, that's interesting if there's interest behind it. But from what I see is I see a scientist who recognizes that there's data that is out there that people simply don't know about, and that there's these weird anomalies in nature that are worth studying, right? So we don't want to complicate things too much, and we also may not want to simplify things too much. And we also want to look at imagination and creativity, again, these more right brain aspects. But what we are especially here to do, and what I'm here to do, is not to debate all these little things, but to observe the cult behavior. If this individual cannot do his science, if he's going to be attacked for doing his science, we have to think, are we creating a cult-like environment? And how would you feel if you're just merely pointing out different data and people don't want you to even be a part of that conversation or even listen to you because you go against the grain? I can care less if somebody says I identify this or identify as that, because I'm not emotionally attached or charged to any particular position. I might, again, say that there's only male and female, and some people are going to get triggered from that, and other people are going to celebrate that. But I'm not looking for a celebration or people getting upset. I just want people to live their lives and not live in these sort of cult mentalities with any position. And so, regardless of what we're talking about, and regardless of even how science is conducted, maybe we have to look at the response of the people. But how is science conducted? Is that even solid?
Those who cut corners or those who are sloppy, let alone those who are fraudulent, can publish more.
A new study published in Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences did a large-scale data analysis of scientific literature with case studies.
And what they uncovered in this big study, assuming their study isn't full of fraud, I guess, is that there is a sophisticated network spanning the entire globe of scientific fraud.
Big money uses money to influence and persuade scientists to write data that was not actually found in experiments.
Often when we think about fraud, we're thinking about lone actors, people who are doing bad science kind of on their own. Maybe they're cheating the system a little bit, making up some figures. But what they found in this big study was actually it's more like there's organized crime within the scientific world. Millions of dollars exchanging hands, going back and forth in order for people to advance their careers in illegitimate ways. Authors of this paper are saying, hey, if we can't even control fraud pre-AI, what on earth are we going to do now that AI is out there and it can create, fake papers in just a few seconds? Because how this large-scale fraud works is they have these paper mills that are just cranking out huge numbers of papers. And then they sell them to academics who can then publish them without actually having done any work. There's one expert, Dr. Elizabeth Bick, who has been working on fraud in science and scientific integrity for a really long time. And she's done some studies to see, okay, what happens if we report a whole bunch of these fraudulent papers?
And after 5 years, after reporting these papers, unfortunately, 2/3 of these papers had not been taken action upon. 27% had been corrected, tiny sliver of expression of concern, and then 7% were retracted.
Certain reviewers, so when I say reviewer, what I mean is the process always includes a blind reviewer, so the names are not exchanged, and it's an expert in the field who knows that topic. So some reviewers would say, you can't have protein in this fossil, because it's a fossil and it's too old to have proteins in it. So therefore, no matter what your evidence seems to show, you can't publish this.
Basically, they said that transparency about good results increases trust, which kind of makes sense, right?
Yeah.
But then transparency about bad news, like what we're talking about here, decreases trust. Even some scientists, they don't even want to call out the fraud and let the public know because it's dangerous to the reputation of science. The science is a tool, and that tool can be used in a good way or a bad way depending on how you're using it.
Yeah, and in this study where they were looking at transparency in science, one of the results they came to was, well, we could lie about it. That would help.
That would increase trust.
Were like, but that's not really sustainable.
Avery,
and it's not really ethical.
I want you to trust me, so I'm going to lie to you.
Right?
Right?
So they did say not a good solution, not a good long-term solution. So they did argue for a different solution instead.
That's right, they did. The community note is still there, even though we showed using their own science, their own journals, that it was misinformation.
And of course, this controversy that they're sort of bringing upon themselves by saying that scientific or academic papers are wrong can be within itself wrong. And so it's worth questioning everything. And I'm sure that maybe these researchers would want the same thing for themselves, as even there was a little joke thrown in with these presenters saying, well, what if this is a fraudulent study? So it's worth questioning everything, but we do have to have some sort of ground. And the problem is that that ground could still go against science or legitimate efforts to trying to find out the truth. So people who are content creators may receive something called community notes or strikes or what have you on certain platforms saying, no, this is not the correct opinion. This is the correct worldview. This is the way you have to look at things. And it can actually make people more fervent, more aggressive in their sense of wanting to share information. And so these notes may actually cause more problems than good by trying to educate people on the truth. Notice that when someone's trying to share something that goes against a current belief system, they might say it's impossible and that there's no way in the world that that could be the case. And if they're not telling people problems or they're pushing certain solutions and they make it sound good and they have the right funding and they have the right media, there can be a lot of convincing mechanisms to really purport a lie. But as the presenters said, lying is not really sustainable because it will lose trust in the public eye over time as it begins to get exposed. But the problem is, if it's of the past, people may entirely forget about it and not think it's really relevant. and then they could just kind of bury it down the rabbit hole, these different platforms, or they can create a whole system to sort of purport this lie to make it seem as though it is not a lie at all. So while it's important to recognize lying isn't the best thing and it's not going to gain trust in the long run, if you have a cult following around the lie, then that lie is going to continue. And it's worth saying that, again, people follow lies thinking they're truth. People follow evil thinking it's good. And that's what makes it precisely ever more dangerous. And so rather than just exposing the lie, you can actually expose the mechanisms by which people follow a lie. Help one become more aware of their actions, their dedication, their reflection, their time, away from the material so they can look at it with a new set of eyes. As you will see, there are people debating about science and religion endlessly on the internet, and you have to ask the question if they really ever took a step back. Just maybe they could actually do even better science and find an even greater faith if they do so. So as you can see, we could be treating science itself as a cult, but we could also be conducting science as a cult. So let's hear from some of these figures who are outliers who really challenge this idea of science, maybe by distinguishing good science versus great science.
What's really disturbing, and I think something that really hasn't been seized upon, is that great science is often very different. It's not just good science turned up to 11, which is my usual line. It's in fact a different process, and it borders on the irresponsible. It has to do with crossing the adaptive valley, to posit something that makes no sense, to say things that are in fact wrong for a period of time before they're right. What you want to do is not self-select on bloodlines, but self-select on ability, and then allow the truly extraordinary, the eccentricities of their minds, because it's like great wood has a grain to it, and a sculptor would never impose the figure without first consulting the wood as to which way it wishes to be moved and shaped. At the moment, you actually need a Hail Mary. And nobody wants to work on a Hail Mary because it makes us look non-respectable. Now, if somebody had said, in the 1800s, we're going to have the power of the sun on the surface of the earth, they would have sounded like a lunatic. On the other hand, now we know that that's entirely doable. So at the moment, I worry that even over my lifetime, we've learned how not to take our dreams seriously, how not to channel them into science, how not to bring rigor to our imagination. And so we're chasing people with true imagination out of the sciences, because what we're saying is that that's not good science. The problem is that we've diminished scientists so far below administrators that we have to seek their permission. And I think what is time for is a scientific revolution in which we tell the administrators to get the hell out of our labs. Science is extremely frustrating, but it's got very high leverage. We should actually be truthful about science, and we're not being truthful. We're trying to make science into something that is mildly interesting. And you're signing up people for careers that are incredibly frustrating, decreasing in prestige. And in fact, one of the few things you can do with science is shut down a planet with fair ease. I made a radical decision not to listen to my learning differences in school. And so while school was telling me that I was not very smart, I just decided that school was the problem and I was not. And so I followed that path, and that battle probably formed me. Schools try to stamp out anyone with a learning difference, and I believe that these things aren't disabilities, but they're superpowers with negative externalities. And what they do is they tease out teaching disabilities on the part of the teaching profession. The teaching profession doesn't want to have teaching disabilities, so they turn around and create learning disabilities, which are actually non-existent for the most part.
It wouldn't be the first time that a scientist or somebody who studies the world would be a rebel in school. We talked about Albert Einstein and the whole model of schooling built around obedience as taught by John Taylor Gatto, who was an award-winning school teacher who ended up exposing the school system. There's a lot of suppression in perhaps a child wanting to do science or use their imagination, which allows them to do great science. Now, there's people who don't like some of the speakers I'm sharing on the screen, and maybe they'll say, oh, these guys are religious or these guys are grifters, but look at what they're saying. It has been in history that many people who have challenged the status quo ended up later on being right. And it's not that they're necessarily trying to become special or trying to be interesting or trying to do something wrong, right? But it's people who maybe are just doing their own research, who are coming to their own conclusions. And it's important that we listen to each other if we want to actually see, okay, I want to help them. I want to prove them wrong. I need to first open my heart to them. I can't necessarily be yelling at them and saying, you need to follow what I say because I have the truth. For he even said that administrators get in the way of good science or great science because authority itself is not truth. The appeal to authority fallacy is that, oh, this person in a lab coat said it. Oh, this person who's a doctor said it. That doesn't necessarily make it true. And of course, we talked about the problem with academia. So you tie that in, and it's like, okay, their upbringing, their very own childhood was within itself very cult-like. So would you be surprised if their own work is cult-like? And so it should sound rather alarming when he says that scientists can shut down a planet with fair ease. Now notice again he says that there's an emphasis on imagination and creativity, and that rigor, this intellectual rigor, can actually backfire. But ironic enough that we need this complexity of seeing the whole picture. It's just that maybe it's not intellectually rigorous, maybe it's more emotionally rigorous. Maybe it's opening up other parts to ourselves other than just analyzing data and numbers and statistics all day. Because again, we could be filtering that statistic and those numbers through our own biases and through what we feel to be right. Maybe there is less need to fix and figure out and more to work with and to listen more, to recognize any methods rather than superimposing our own methods that we think is best or that we were told is best. Maybe we don't need even a Hail Mary because maybe the truth and what we need to figure out is so simple that we do not see it. And so here's a summary slide talking about the problems with research material. There's funding bias, there's publication bias, there's replication crisis, there's a pressure to publish, and there's conflicts of interest. There's also many different videos on the web talking about the sort of unscientific nature of science that can happen at different times, and again, different people and different topics that maybe are more touchy that maybe mainstream science doesn't want to talk about. This can create alternative science points of view, which can then get attacked and scapegoated and used as a boogeyman. But there's even a whole essay in 2005 that says why most published research findings are false. And more articles and videos have been coming up about this. And so you might say, well, I thought you don't want this to be too rigorous because it might backfire. That's right. But it doesn't mean we don't have any standard at all to our science. You see, it's about seeing both points of view here. If we're truly scientific, we want to be holistic-minded, so that way we can study everything and bear in mind all these variables, just like we're doing the study itself. I mean, think about this video online, a screenshot from it, which basically predicts the future. 8 trillion years. I think I lost count of how many times I said trillion. I mean, how could you possibly know what is going to happen that long from now? So it's sort of just a visual episode that can maybe inspire some people and maybe shock some people, but it isn't necessarily going to educate them or help them become more open-minded. There have been many others who have challenged scientism, including Paul Feyerabend. He believes that lay people should have a say in scientific matters that affect their lives. So science maybe isn't just secluded to these people in lab coats. Maybe it's more out in the open and there's other ways we can do it. Similarly, Robert Anton Wilson, a psychologist, talked about model agnosticism, which is the idea that all models of reality are just that. They're models. They are useful tools for navigating the world, but should not be mistaken for absolute truths. Edmund Bradley saying once a given hypothesis has been accepted as received wisdom by the government, researchers with alternative hypotheses not only find it difficult to get funding, but they also find it difficult just to find a job and teach classes. They get blackballed by other professors, and so there's a lot of roadblocks that happen. So maybe you can't blame someone who then tries to go online and gain a following there for their only means of sharing information. On the topic of psychology, there are many people who criticize psychiatry, including Scientologists. But Dennis Fox, who's a psychologist and lawyer, talks about how we may categorize people for certain social control, and this type of languaging, including oppositional defiant disorder and what Benjamin Rush, the father of American psychiatry, called anarchia, was to label those who believed in more freedom. This can just cause more problems, and it's just as a means for more control. Bruce Levine also shares tons of statistics talking about all the financial interest that go into some of the medical profession, and again, all this is tied into science and academia. He even says that physicians joined the Nazi Party in the killing operations not at gunpoint, not by force, but of their own volition. There is not a single reported case of a physician who was shot, incarcerated, or penalized in any way for refusing to participate in the killing operations. Now, why is that important? Because we're talking about people going along with, oh, this is what my administrator says, oh, this is what the science is, that must be the truth, and that is what I must uphold. That includes maybe pushing out my fellow man who disagrees and to say, this person is pseudoscientific, this person is pushing misinformation, we must suppress this person, we must not allow them to enter the discourse, we must fire them, or what have you. So people are being complicit with evil willingly, even if they know they're doing evil, but in many cases they don't know, and they are just convinced into what they believe to be right, maybe the science that they believe is superior. The Nazis had their own science, not to mention Nazi scientists came over to America. Even pro-slavery advocates had their own science, and this was huge. Back in the 1800s, you had a leading pro-slavery advocate, George Fitzhugh, who created this whole book called Sociology for the South, talking about how there's a failure of free society, saying that all government is slavery. We need slavery because we need government, and he is known among coining the term sociology as a whole field of study of its own. Martin Luther King Jr. even said that slavery in America was not perpetrated by merely human badness, but also by human blindness. He says that human beings cannot continue to do wrong without eventually reaching out for some sort of rationalization to clothe their acts in the garments of righteousness. Science could be used for all sorts of things. You look at Aldous Huxley and his predictions. He says, I believe the world's rulers will discover that infant conditioning and narco-hypnosis are more efficient as instruments of governments than clubs and prisons. Now, I'm not saying all this and sharing these researchers to say, hey, here's a certain agenda I'm pushing, I'm trying to be anti-authoritarian, I'm trying to go against the status quo, I'm trying to show all these people who are rebelling. I'm trying to help you see different points of view. And if you're opposed to it, you're violently opposed to it, and you are emotionally charged right now, that's just more of a reason to look into yourself and ask yourself, well, why does this exist then? Why do people think this? Can we do science on this very phenomena? Can we just sit as a philosopher for a moment and think and reflect and listen so we're not trapped in scientism? And the thing about Huxley, he said the real hopeless victims of mental illness are to be found among those who appear to be most normal. Their perfect adjustment to that abnormal society is a measure of their mental sickness. And while in 1984 by George Orwell there was harsh control, torture, and brutal force used to keep people in line, in Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, citizens were kept in line by drugs, hypnosis, genetic conditioning, and pleasurable distractions. So you can say science was essentially weaponized against people. Intelligence was used to control people, not mere strength and force. So this is looking at the extreme sides of science, where it could go, what it can be. We can't just ignore the possibility because, again, these are variables in our study of science itself. What exists out there? The Internet of Bio-Nano Things, IOBNT, which is a network of biological and nanoscale devices that can collect, process, and transmit data within biological environments. And in application, this can do all sorts of things like detecting health within the body, targeted drug delivery, monitoring when people should do certain things in their body. Essentially, it could be sort of like an internal doctor, right? And of course, this also raises the idea of AI and integrating that within the human body. And people will, again, say all the good things about this, not necessarily sharing the bad things. Or some people will push the bad things so much that it makes other people say, well, they're just crazy conspiracy theorists. I don't want to look at that. I'm just going to continue living my life while these things might be actually affecting them too, and they don't realize it. So you have people who are complacent, who just go along with things, people who are actively promoting it, and then people who are violently against it. But you can't have people who are maybe outside of these camps trying to see the bigger picture, saying, yeah, these things do exist and maybe they could be used, but let's look at the bigger picture. Maybe we don't need these at all if we are healthy or if we are in tune more with our own body and listening to our body. We don't need something listening to our body for us. We don't need a doctor if we're our own doctor, for instance. Look at technocracy, right? This idea that technology controls people and their government. Well, many people might see that as an extreme. They might say, well, that's never going to happen. But it is very possible if people think, hey, humans are flawed, and I think AI and technology could do a better job than us, and hey, it will actually increase my strength and make me do better if I put this inside of my body. There's all sorts of benefits that are proposed with this. Cognitive enhancement, biological hacking, enhanced interrogation. But there's also covert surveillance and neurocontrol. If you're only looking at the good side of things and not the bad side, then of course you're going to be convinced to do it, especially if you don't see any alternative. Notice here Dr. Jose Delgado, who says we need a program of psychosurgery and political control of our society. The purpose is physical control of the mind. Everyone who deviates from the given norm can be surgically mutilated. The individual may think that the most important reality is his own existence, but this is only his personal point of view. We must electrically control the brain. Someday, armies and generals will be controlled by electrical stimulation of the brain. And he says that, when people think that the individual is important, it lacks historical perspective. Man does not have the right to develop his own mind. He's very confident in what he thinks he knows. And the common trend among these outliers who are challenging the status quo is they're not necessarily saying, hey, I know what the science is. I know that this thing is bad. I'm not claiming to know. I'm just asking questions. And I actually think it would be a good criticism of me to say that, hey, you are pushing something, Corey, and you don't see that you're pushing it. I want to know what I'm unconscious of, what fanaticism I might have, what dogmatism I might have, because that's how I can improve just as much as it is how you can improve and how we escape all cults. Merely talking about something can make a lot of people start to assume that you are a part of it. Merely showing that there might be a different solution may make a whole lot of people think that you're pushing that solution. Notice Matthias Desmond also talks about this idea of technocracy. He says it's a utopian society led by experts, subordinates individuals to the collective, appeals through promise of artificial paradise, imposes control based on anxiety and necessity. The alternative, he says, is accepting uncertainty, fostering creativity and individuality. Carl Jung also talked about the problems with science. He says science conveys a picture of the world from which a real human psyche appears to be excluded, the very antithesis of the humanities. Are we meant to be in this world where technology is in control of us? And maybe this has problems. Maybe it's not all the best. Here's a poem talking about this. They spout about the grandest things, freedom, truth, and kindness. Sure, they know just what they mean by revelatory blindness. Socrates was the first to note the modes a social curse. Still, wondering what we really mean feels costlier and worse. And it's worth noting that Socrates was famously killed for questioning the status quo. Is our system truly human? Is it treating people with kindness, or is it expecting of them to know the sort of legalese, the scientific code? Michael Huemer talks about the problem of legalese and how laws and legal documents are frequently incomprehensible to ordinary people, and that this sophistication can sometimes create a lot of superiority in certain scientists or doctors or politicians because they're using this fancy language. Oh, they must be smart. And he talks about how you can actually cloak wrong actions or certain behaviors by using different language, which is similar to what cults do, is they change the language. There's even a whole book about this called Robopaths, People as Machines, by Louis Yablonsky. It's worth noting just how many people have left their own positions, doctors, scientists, lawyers, in recent years due to recent events, and how I can't even really talk much about those events because of the sort of flagging systems that exist on social media. But look at this list of all these professionals, and people will say, well, they're not professional. Say, oh, well, they're unscientific and everything that they say is wrong, or maybe they're mixing truth with lies to fit their own agenda. And that could be the case for certain individuals, but to say that they're all wrong or that they have no basis to their understanding and that all their followers also have no basis and that they're all being deceived, well, that's not looking deeper into what is actually maybe going on. That's the bigger picture. Well, that might just be an excuse to not look at people's feelings and their emotions and their imaginations and creativity that is an essential part in our health, but also alternative ideas and science that maybe is being suppressed that we don't have access to. Even in the field of archaeology, people are being called pseudo-scientific as a sort of a term, just like conspiracy theorists, which might actually make more people follow them. Or some people say, no, this is not what I want to look at, so I'm just going to disregard it altogether. But in either case, it does not help us do science. Websites like Natural News, which has dozens of other websites and projects and even their own lab and science material on heavy metals and all bunch of different topics. You're talking hundreds of thousands of articles since the early 2000s, fake news, disinformation, far-right extremism, all these titles, which what does that really do to help investigate these ideas deeper, other than just identify them and put them into some neat box to throw aside? I think a good example of a scientist coming together with somebody who may totally disagree with them or have different worldviews that challenge the status quo is the conversation between Jiddu Krishnamurti and David Bohm. I think it's just a good example to show what is possible when people open their minds and they ask questions. Because you have many channels on the internet which you can say are cults of cult exposers, and they often can just make a living by attacking other people and their worldviews or their guests and just the different ideas that they bring to the surface. We cannot ignore people's concerns, their passions, their experiences, and also the alternative information and the people leaving. There's a lot going on here, but what about the people who are peddling mainstream science and these agendas? What do they have to say? Are they fanatical just as much as the people who attack them? And maybe that would actually tell us why.
Nobody will be safe if not everybody is vaccinated.
Are you vaccinated, if I
Yes.
may ask?
Yeah. I mean, I'm very pro-vaccination. Yeah. I believe the science is unequivocal.
Can you imagine that in 10 years when we are sitting here, we have an implant in our brains and I can immediately feel, because you all will have implants. Just think of sensors planted into our brains.
Basically implanted in your skull. So, but it would be flush with your skull. So you basically take out a chunk of skull, put the Neuralink device in there. You put the electrode, you'd insert the electrode threads very carefully into the brain.
it doesn't change what you are doing. It changes you if you take a genetic editing. It's a fusion of the physical, the digital, and the biological world. That's really the essence of the fourth industrial revolution.
A merger with biological intelligence and machine intelligence.
An effort for man to merge with machine in a healthy way.
Yes.
To beat machines, you basically have to merge with machines.
Most likely, yes.
As work is changing, is a universal basic income really a solution to this problem?
I think ultimately we will have to have some kind of universal basic income. And I think some kind of a universal basic income is going to be necessary.
Decarbonization of the economy.
Where are they traveling? How are they traveling? What are they eating? What are they consuming on the platform? So, individual carbon footprint tracker. Stay tuned. We don't have it operational yet, but this is something that we're working on.
I mean, my top recommendation, honestly, would be just to have a carbon tax.
This global reset is necessary
to protect vaccinated workers from unvaccinated co-workers.
The folks out there tonight shouting, the anti-vaxxers, those people are putting us all at risk.
This is a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
You need to condemn those people. You need to correct them.
You're selfish because if I'm protected and you're around me, then I'm fine. But you're me. Sorry. If you're not vaccinated, then you're not. You're racist.
Next up after the break, why your 4-year-old not wearing a hazmat suit to preschool is a threat to my safety.
So a little bit of humor there, because we can get too serious on these topics and people can again become super paranoid, or people can just ignore it. And I don't want you to also get offended just because of some of this humor, because some people will say, well, this is a really serious matter. And frankly, I will tell you, this is no laughing matter in the face of the reality that many bad things could happen from good intentions. We know this happened many times in history. And if nobody is thinking about that possibility and warning others that it can get to that point, then who will? And some people may have childhood traumas that are resurfacing where they see these things because they maybe had a smaller experience in their own lives of that sort of tyranny. Cults can take place among whether it's alternative or mainstream groups, despite the fact that these two groups might only call each other cults, just like you see with religion and religion or atheism and religion. And people are turning fanatical because of other fanatics, and they might use that as an excuse for their own fanaticism. And again, this can happen on any side with any topic. I'm not trying to blame any particular group of people. But you have to ask yourself, when you watch those clips of these different presidents, these people who are in positions of power over other people's lives, who are talking about millions of people across the world, is this language one of science or is it not? Nobody will be safe. Everyone will have implants. It changes you, not just your behavior. Merge machines in a healthy way. Well, who determines what is considered healthy in this case? Universal basic income, it's necessary. The global reset, it's necessary. Those people are putting us at risk. Condemn those people. Don't just teach them. Don't just share a different way. Condemn them, attack them, right? Because they're enemies of all these scientists. They're enemies of all the consensus, right? Everybody agrees. To beat machines, merge with them. Don't use them as a tool and use them consciously, or maybe not use them at all. You have to work with it by merging yourself directly with it. This is the only thing, because, hey, well, all these other countries are doing it, and it's getting to the point where we have to, right? There's a lot of justifications and excuses we make. And again, I'm not saying this is the language of everyone just because I showed a bunch of clips and just because I'm repeating some of what they said. But what does it matter even if someone in a high position, someone like Elon Musk, says, oh, I had this thing happen to me? What matters is that, is it really safe? Is this something that should happen to everyone? And by should, do I mean need? Do I mean that this has to be mandated across the whole world? Because it's one thing to recommend something and another to mandate it, to require. And that's when coercion might enter the equation, and then you have a little bit more culty behavior. So again, it's one thing to do science, to find out objective morality, to do philosophy or any field of study, and another to say this is the only way, this is what must happen, right? So scientists could essentially be against science. Just like how preachers could be against religion or teachers against education. Even worse, all of these people not knowing that they are doing so. It's the language, it's the behavior that we don't see that we are contributing to. I want you to look at this footage here of some of these rallies, these protests, part of the Extinction Rebellion as well, climate change protests, and notice people maybe using certain symbols together, doing a lot of certain rituals and certain outfits that are really reminiscent of cult behavior or something straight out of a cult documentary, just trying to perhaps gain attention, doing some really extreme things so that way the internet starts to see more of their message. But you have to ask, at what cost? At what sanity does it take for people to come out in the streets and put themselves on display like this? It could be fun, it could be theatrical, and maybe this is why people do it, because they say, hey, I want to protest, but I want to do it in a way that is effective. I want to do it in a way that shows to everybody. But in that sense, you have to be careful if you are creating a sort of cult-like environment where you are promoting those behaviors and you are making these sort of absolute statements, and then that you do want coercion coming from up high, telling everybody else what to do with their lives. People who are like, yeah, I don't want to really be a part of this group, I don't really agree with this idea. Are they going to be vocal? Are they going to be the ones going on Twitter, on social media? But let's just look at climate change as an example of something that many people use as a means for science, right? This is something that concerns a lot of scientists, and there are people who disagree with it.
Science is no longer real science and has morphed into a religion. And I don't mean this metaphorically, I mean literally. From the perspective of theoretical history, science now fulfills social functions that are characteristic of religion. And a part of this would be the whole narrative centered around climate change as an existential threat to the planet arising from human sins against nature, and as an opportunity for political theatre, and as a source of legitimacy for political control over economic behaviour. Let's face it, most people who champion those claims have no personal understanding of the mathematical models or meteorological data supposed to underpin them. These make good headlines because they feed into the narrative of climate change is bad, and because people like such neat factoids. You don't need to waste your time ploughing through the 6 volumes of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, or that 8 volumes of Hodgkin's Italy and Her Invaders, because the answer is simple. It was climate change. That's all you need to know. But when you look into these claims, the researchers are generally not historians, but geographers or what have you. And the argument is basically one of correlation. The climate changed, Rome fell, there's your answer. And since climate is always changing, it's not difficult to find some kind of correlation to whatever historical event you want. I'd be considered well informed compared to, say, the most famous climate campaigner of today. Can she spot the mathematical mistakes in climate models? Has she read Leroy-Ladure's work on millennium of climate change in Europe? These people are not handing out technical studies of atmospheric dynamics or economic modelling of climate impacts backed up by historical data. It's an appeal to your emotions. It is a moral crusade backed up by dramatic predictions of, well, who knows what. It's never really that clear, but presumably mass death, the collapse of civilization, and the extinction of large parts of the biosphere, mediated by rising sea levels in conjunction with droughts and desertification. related to this is the way that climate change can explain almost any negative development. So global warming will cause flooding, but it will also cause droughts, and it will cause heating, but it will also cause cooling and even trigger an ice age. So yes, children, activism, heavyweight politics, and the one-sidedness of the whole thing. These are some red flags that suggest we are dealing with a cultural, ideological phenomenon, not a scientific or factual one. Is the Earth warming? Well, it depends on where you choose your starting point. Are humans responsible, or how much are they responsible for? Well, it depends on how the climate would be changing if humans weren't around. And who can really claim to know that? Is warming necessarily harmful? Well, it depends on what you think is harmful, but warming is usually considered to be a good thing. And in any case, life and society seemed perfectly capable of adapting to changing climate. Are climate-related policies actually the ones the human race should be pursuing? Well, it depends on what your goals are and how you think economies work or ought to work. We ought to be able to disagree and debate them. But of course, the argument is that the issue is too important to debate. We're told this is a crisis, an emergency. There's no time to be quibbling over the details. We have to act now. Because an informed person like myself is considered ignorant for deviating from the orthodoxy, that in itself shows we are dealing with an ideological phenomenon. This is a faith-based belief system, not a rational or logical one, not a scientific one.
So are we able to entertain these ideas? Or are we just going to say, oh, it's too important to debate, and I'm going to attack this silly person because they're against all the scientists and all the correlation and all this data. They're just cherry picking and trying to be a grifter, trying to make their own money off of their own agenda. But he's right, is he not, when he says that most people don't know the claims that they make. They're out there on the streets protesting, and just like the average Christian who maybe hasn't read all the books on religion and spirituality in the world, they might make claims that they can't necessarily support. Does that make them a bad person? Does that make them unfounded? No, but it's worth understanding our humility, understanding what we don't know, because we may not want to face that. It's uncomfortable having to face the fact that we don't have it all figured out. And this helps us battle scientism, which is the religion cult aspect of science. In case you're wondering, how could all these scientists be wrong for any scenario in life? Well, how could millions of people follow one person in Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia or some communist place in China? It doesn't matter what it is. If there's any cult, there's going to be cult behavior and tons of followers. Using kids as a model, as an advertisement, saying that people are bad and therefore we need to do this, and trying to make all sorts of correlations and everything that happens to use as a support for an agenda. These are warning signs of cult behavior, and I don't think he's wrong to point this out, especially when there's another kid who, similar age to Greta, who is known as this, figure on the climate change world, and she's known as the anti-Greta. Well, here's her response to that and why she is skeptical of the mainstream narrative and called all sorts of names.
The climate has always been changing, and so it's ridiculous to say that we deny climate change.
If the media wants to portray as anti-Greta, then go ahead. She is not about the science. She's basically just about spewing panic and telling people to change their lives entirely, demanding that governments control the lives of the people on this earth everywhere.
I hate to see so many young people especially panicking about climate change, about a topic that they haven't even done their research about.
I am not the puppet of the right wing or the climate deniers or the Heartland Institute either. We as climate realists, our agenda is just fighting for freedom.
If you were to question the mainstream narrative, then you would be labeled a climate change denier or climate denier, which is ludicrous. Climate change at this point is mostly just about politics and about alarmism, spreading panic and protesting for Fridays for Future. We have gained many benefits, not only from using cheap and reliable energy sources efficiently, like fossil fuels, but also from warming. For example, better crop yields, and we can feed the population because it's been getting warmer.
They just basically choose and pick their own factors that they want to use, their variables for their models. And so it's really just playing a computer game to me, and it's not good science based on real world data.
Do you believe the planet is heating up at a dangerous rate?
No, I do not believe that. It really is extremely overstated by the IPCC in that, if at all, the CO2 emissions, man-made CO2 emissions, are having just a very tiny effect.
The recyclable paper sleeve wrapped around your coffee cup with a plastic lid on it is doing nothing to save the planet. I don't want you to panic, I want you to think. Und dabei kleben alle, wie Sie wissen, an Greta. Ich bin nicht anti-Greta. Denn das ist genau der Titel, von dem die Demonstranten da draußen wollen, dass ich ihn mir anhefte. Damit sie einen weiteren Sündenbock haben, den sie simpel pauschalisieren können. Meine Nachricht, die ich vermitteln will, ist viel mehr als Anti-Greta. Ich bin nicht Anti-Greta, sondern ich möchte niemandem aufzwingen, seine Glaubenssätze an den Klimawandel abzulegen, sondern ich möchte, dass wir mehr Diskussionsmöglichkeiten wieder haben. Ich möchte, dass wir einander zuhören können und dass wir Skepsis anbringen können in der Wissenschaft.
You know, there's a quote from before the Industrial Revolution that says that nature's secret is patience. And I think it's worth recognizing that science, knowledge, wisdom, truth, philosophy, all these things take time to develop. Our own journey, our own growth, our own brain development takes time. You can't expect a child to just be witty and know it all right off the bat. You can't expect the science to be all figured out just because we have AI and technology at our fingertips and we've done all the tests and all the information is out there. There's still information that people don't know about. There's still ways of perceiving the world that people cannot even grasp. They just have never really considered the fact that in order to get to there, they might have to break all their barriers and all their own previous conditioning. Perhaps the thing I am emphasizing here, which is possibility, is the very freedom that these speakers are promoting. Possibility, coming with freedom, is the antithetical choice to control, which doesn't give you a choice, doesn't give you the idea of possibility. It says, we have it all figured out. There is no choice other than this one choice because everyone says so. And no matter what, even if it is super true, wouldn't you want someone to come to their own conclusion, say, yeah, you know, I agree, it is true. Because you don't have to convince me, and it's not because you are someone really important, it's because I understand it's true. I'm not here to debate the details, but let's talk about what I think you might be thinking about when it comes to science, especially when we're talking about religion. This idea of atheism. What do thinkers like Jordan Peterson or Brett Weinstein have to talk about this? Because many people may not want to hear the fact that there might be an atheist that still has faith, and they're just trying to find themselves, or they're trying to study from these worldviews, and then they want to maybe have an experience, and they are just having these conversations without necessarily having any set conclusion. As it is with the concept of time we discussed, perhaps life is more of a journey than a destination.
So the great fallacy of atheism is that it is safe and adaptive to try to leave the receptor unbound, because the issue is that there is some metaphysics that is going to bind to that receptor whether or not the truth value of that metaphysics can be decided. Given that, I found that I happened to be in possession of one of the more benign things that could bind that receptor. So just the way it's very unlikely that you speak no language at all.
The question for everyone is, what is your highest priority? What is what is your guiding star? What is the thing that organizes your world together? And for all intents and purposes, that is undistinguishable from a God, because it's something that you celebrate, it's something that you lift up, it's something that, especially if it's as a group, that you see together as something to put above you and to follow. And so I think that Jordan is absolutely right, that you cannot, worship is an aspect of humanity which is inevitable and finds itself reflected at lower levels in everything we do. People don't realize that worship is an organizational structure, that what worship does is it binds people together towards something that's higher than them. And so that's why you have acts of veneration that are lower. That's why you have a national holiday. That's why you have a flag. That's why you have these national buildings that, these parliaments that when you see, you're like, oh, that's where that's where the laws come from, right? That beautiful building is where we receive our laws from. And so all of that organizes reality. And what Christians are saying is we put as the highest the source of all things that is also bound in love, right? That is an image of pure love, that is the source of all reality, and expressed itself in self-sacrifice on the cross. And we're saying that is the highest principle. That is the thing under which we should all be subject to. And subjecting ourselves to that is not just in your mind or ethical. It means you go somewhere, you turn around that thing, right? You sing songs, people know that because people do it for their sports team, for goodness sake. Like people, the most atheistic secularist will put on their stupid jersey and go watch their team and cheer and sing the songs and do all the things that people do in church for their sports team. But when I say, let's do that now for the source of our reality, which is the divine love that holds us all together, oh no, that's superstition. That's superstition, that's ridiculous, It's like, well, I think one of those binds us together more than the other.
Scientism, which is saying science can indeed explain everything. But that just doesn't work. Einstein was very clear on this, and he put it this way. He said, you can talk about the ethical foundations of science, but you cannot talk about the scientific foundations of ethics. In other words, science doesn't give you answers to the ethical questions. We're trying to answer the question, how does something work? Or why does something function as it does? But there is a third question, and that's the why of purpose. And it doesn't tell us the ethics of things. And that is very important, and the greatest scientists realize that. I think perhaps it's best put in the words of a Nobel Prize winner, Sir Peter Medawar, a very distinguished scientist. And he said it's very easy, and I'm paraphrasing, it's very easy to see that science doesn't deal with all of reality because it cannot answer the simple questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going? Why am I here? And he himself pointed out you had to turn to literature and philosophy, and of course I'd want to add theology, to answer those questions. The biggest questions to which we want answers, the why, especially when they're whys about personal existential experience, science doesn't answer them. And as someone put it, science can tell you that if you put arsenic in your granny's tea, it will give her a pretty rough time. But science won't tell you if you should do it or not.
Yes.
So the whole ethical dimension, questions of love, and above all, I suppose, encompassing those, questions of meaning, science doesn't deal with. We got to look elsewhere.
And so there's books like this, The Moral Landscape, by Sam Harris, which talks about how science can determine human values, right? And so he advocates that scientists can begin conversations about a normative science of morality. So it is perhaps possible to use science for moral claims, not necessarily having religion. One of my favorite quotes is that, hey, you can have morality without religion because it's called empathy. But maybe it's the stories and it's the development of character that actually helps our morality. Maybe it's facing some of these moral challenges that are found in these spiritual texts and all these different perspectives and practices and rituals that help us open up and face the problems so we can see some of the solutions. It could be quite complicated, as you can imagine, because there's so many different types of religions, just as there's so many different types of sciences. It's worth noting that there are differences between old science and new science as well, as many of the old sciences relied on the Bible and church teachings, or just common sense, ancient authorities, and reason or logic, whereas maybe new science is more about using certain methods, and you can't just use the Bible or reason. You need to have these more standardized, approved, tested ideas, things that maybe are still confirmed by certain authorities. But what I think people are coming to is that you need to have an integration of these two, because one is founded on the other, and in many ways they need each other. As again, we talked about this left brain or masculine and this right brain feminine, we can see that there's a lot of story and symbolism and ritual that might be needed, or that is still even being practiced in atheism without people knowing. And we can accept things the way they are. We can accept the fact that people think different from us, but some people might want to take their own position to the extreme. They want to make a display of everything. They say, well, maybe it's okay to go into my desires. Maybe it's okay to make problems worse, because then people will start to see, and then the solutions will come out. So this idea of accelerationism has been used to worsen existing conditions for a favorable outcome. I might liken this to the idea of forcing something to happen, when in reality, if we're saying there's these sort of karmic laws or cause and effect, consequentialism, then we would see that there are going to be people waking up as things get worse. Not to mention, there are so many other ways to change the world, like showing by example and civil disobedience, that do not involve intentionally doing wrong behavior. And the problem with this philosophy is that it actually says, hey, it's okay to do bad, it's okay to make things worse, and that would be the exact opposite of morality, despite these people claiming, well, it's for the greater good. And these arguments, again, are guaranteeing wrong action for the possibility of something good, and looking at things under the lens of a narrative, disregarding individuals and their rights, and caring for people as people because of some ideology they have in their head. One speaker who a lot of people respect is Alex O'Connor, who has been sharing this atheist perspective online to many individuals while using a lot of biblical arguments, even sometimes sounding like a Christian. And the reason why people respect him is because he's able to entertain so many different ideas and not just prescribe to, hey, I'm an atheist, this is what it is.
In the online atheist community, atheism is sometimes defined as just a lack of belief in God. It's actually something that's pressed quite a lot. People have wasted a lot of ink over this particular question of what it means. And so I think when I was calling myself a hardcore atheist, I would have been the kind of atheist that says, well, I just lack a belief in God, and that's all atheism is. I find that the agnostic label is a bit more accurate when I'm sort of having general conversations with people to explain where I'm at, which is I obviously can't say that God doesn't exist. Interestingly, when somebody says, well, I know you say you're an atheist, but do you know that God doesn't exist? Or are you technically an agnostic? Fine. But a lot of the time when I speak to a Christian or a theist, and I say, but do you know that God exists? Like, are you certain about it? And they go, well, no, I'm not certain, but I believe it. And I wouldn't say, oh, well, technically you're an agnostic then. Because really what you're saying is sort of, what side broadly do you fall on here? And for me, when observing the world around me, I find so many inexplicable mysteries. So I have to die on that fence of agnosticism, as I put it before. But if you ask me to sort of place a bet, I think that I'm at least suspicious of the idea that this is compatible with a traditional creator type figure. And so I'd sort of fall in that camp. But strictly speaking, I have no idea. The trouble I find myself in is that I can't say, religion is terrible and evil and we're better off without it, but I just don't believe that it's true. Yeah. And so I can't lie to my children for want of a better society. So I'm in a bit of a tough spot. I'm agnostic as well on that question, in other words. Whereas they would say religion is bad. I would say I don't know. I think it's probably too simplistic an analysis.
So is I don't know a sufficient answer in science? Is it possible to say, hey, well, even if we still do science, we don't know? And that's what enables us to do more science? See, I think it's very interesting because you also have agendas such as population control. And there have been many famous figures out there, billionaires per se, who support this idea. But I want you to observe the billionaire Jim Gale, who sort of left his whole industry and went off grid on 50 acres in St. Cloud, Florida. Now, I'm fortunate to know this man and write a book with him talking about permaculture, but there's a reason why he did what he did, and why he is quite skeptical as well about these agendas. And permaculture, frankly, is a science that not a lot of people know about.
So why are all these professionals, these doctors and scientists, and the most educated in Harvard and Yale and all these Ivy League universities, why are they advocating for all of the control mechanisms, right? Why are they advocating for depopulation? Because they believe that unless we depopulate, unless we take out 50% or more of the population of our world, that everybody's going to die and the whole ecosystem is going to die. The point of this message, and the reason why this is the idea whose time has come, stronger than all of the armies of the world, is very simple. Because this also solves their narrative. Even though it's based in lies, we do not have a population problem. We have a poison problem. And we have a use of resources problem. When we simply take out the poisons and put this type of landscape in, this is a carbon sink. So this destroys their narrative, and we have to help them see it. Otherwise, they're going to continue to do what they're doing, and it's going to continue to lead to more division and stress and death. When we take out the poisons and we grow food instead of lawns, then we could have 20, 30, 40 billion people on this planet, and everybody would eat very well. All right? So that's the solution to all the world's biggest problems. Whether you're a Catholic or a Jew or a Muslim, whether you're a Hindu or a Buddhist or an atheist, this one idea brings us together to create a foundation of abundance. And abundance destroys scarcity, and scarcity is the catalyst for war. When we can come together and be the stewards of our land again, using nature, which whoever you call God, whether that's science, Buddha, Allah, Yahweh, God, whatever name you use, whatever you grew up learning, or whatever you've come to learn, when we take the poisons out and become the stewards of our land again. 2.5 years ago, there was nothing here but sand, literally just a blank canvas of sand. And now it's a mega productive system. Integrate the schools and the prisons and the churches. The resources are already available to radically and rapidly change this war narrative to a narrative of abundance and peace.
So maybe it sounds simple. Maybe it sounds like not a Hail Mary. Maybe it sounds unscientific because there's no lab involved. There's no tests or studies involved. But does that make it untrue? There might not be any machines and major investments and AI architecture involved. But does that mean it's worthless? Does that mean it's not worth looking into, not going to benefit our health, not going to build stronger relationships? I think it's quite evident that maybe our connection to nature is worth studying within itself. Maybe it can't be studied because there's so much you can study. There are billions of plants and billions of compounds. It's almost incomprehensible, the world of science that we are able to conduct, the world of religion we are able to imagine, that it's no wonder we have all these debates with each other, and perhaps it's a beautiful thing that we have these differences, and we have to ask if we're trying to create a world that is sterile and doesn't have it. There's more to this life than just numbers and science, isn't there? There's animals, there's life around us that is worth playing and enjoying and not trying to analyze and fix. Maybe we have to look at things totally different. And maybe, similarly, the reason why we feel diseased and feel unhealthy relates to this. So let us look at the biggest cult that may affect us personally in our lives, and certainly affects our very lives.